It's Amazing Grace. So, the structure of DNA. This is my topic today. I don't have a problem with the idea of DNA, that we have something within ourselves that is God-given, that enables our bodies to grow and repair. Truth is Stranger Than Fiction did a video recently about how there may be even an element of spirituality to DNA, which I found very interesting. But in my video, I'm going to focus on what we are told is the structure of DNA. So I'm going to give you a little bit of some background, if you don't already know it. And then I'm going to lead into why I'm questioning it, basically, and where we are today, currently. So if you didn't know, DNA, the structure of DNA, was first produced or expressed by two gentlemen known as Francis Crick and James Watson. I have a picture here of them. Here they are. I'm not actually sure which one's which, but this was the first kind of model they produced of we now know as the double helix. The James Watson and Francis Crick were quite an interesting pair, actually. Now, they didn't actually create any data of their own. They collected and analysed data that already existed, and they put them together in what this article describes as new and insightful ways, which I think is rather an interesting way of describing it. Now, some of the crucial data that they actually obtained came from a lady called Rosalind Franklin. There she is. Now, she was known for doing, this is called Picture 51. Basically what it is it's called an X-ray crystallography picture. Basically they would crystallize molecules of DNA and then expose them to X-rays, and then the X-rays would deflect off of the molecules and they would capture a picture of it. But it takes quite a bit of training and some knowledge and good mathematics, apparently, to work out what a picture like this actually means in 3D form. And she was currently doing that, and apparently she wasn't quite happy to then commit to DNA being a double helix or its actual definite structure, and she was still working on it. Well, she was paired up with someone called Wilkin, and Wilkin actually shared the pictures with Crick and Watson. They then used those images along with other information like the different amino acids that are found in DNA, and then they used that information to kind of work out that it was a helix formation, because apparently they'd worked on other structures that were also helix formations. But really rather quite interesting is when they gathered all this data without Franklin's knowledge, they then took the information they had and their idea of what it might look like to Francis Crick's wife, who was called Odile. Odile Crick was actually an art student in Vienna during the Nazi occupation of Austria, and then she finished her art studies at St Martin's in London. So she was an artist, and so they asked her to draw up a visual representation of what this helix might look like. This is the original picture. Which is really rather quite interesting. So okay, give it the benefit of the doubt, I guess. It's a very first rough sketch. Generally speaking, she was an artist, not a scientist. Really rather quite strange that they asked her to draw it up, but I guess that they agreed that that's scientifically what it would have looked like. I don't know. And then the guys went off and eventually made their own model of the double helix. When they had discovered the data kind of proved that this structure existed, or what they believed it to look like, they went off to a place called the Eagle in Cambridge, which is a pub, and declared as they stormed in that they had discovered the secret of life. I've actually been to this pub, like I say, in Cambridge. Came across it by accident. I didn't even realise that it was famous for anything. I went in for lunch, and literally the walls are covered in all this sort of, Crick and Watson memorabilia and bits and pieces, and yeah, so it's still celebrated today and plastered all over the place. So anyway, so they storm into this pub and declare, like I say, that they have found the secret of life. This was actually before they had actually created the model. So why am I bringing this to your attention? Well, I have been looking online for images of DNA. So, this is now 50, 60 years later, And we have microscopes and electron microscopes and lots of different ways to view things that are not visible to the naked eye. And so I came across several images from electron microscopes and lots of computerized images, as you can see. This apparently is DNA molecule, but of course there's no double helix definition there, as we have all grown up to know it as. This article was put out in 2012. Basically what happened was they created, through water tension or something, the ability to stretch a strand of DNA across two pillars. This is done on an electron microscope, so you can, sort of appreciate that this is obviously very small if this is what it says it is. And this is a close-up of the DNA. Now this, in 2012, is declared the first captured image of DNA with an electron microscope. So basically anything captured before that would have been with a regular microscope, or images that would have just been created through artistic impression, I guess, a bit like Crick's wife. This is still not very clear, and I was actually quite surprised. 2012, and that's the best image we could get. So I looked at other images that was representing DNA. This one I found quite interesting. I actually thought for a second, oh my goodness, like this is much easier to visualize. This is a much more sort of common image of what we would imagine a double helix of DNA to be. But actually it's not DNA. This is nanowire, which is man-made. Basically means very, very thin wire. Ascorbic acid, which carries the same double helix structure. And this is just labeled double helix. It's not DNA. So I don't understand why they can capture an image of ascorbic acid and something as tiny as nanowire, which is 15 nanometers small, and we still don't have an image of DNA in more detail. Again, that's what creates these questions in me. Does it really matter? Yeah, I think it does, because if DNA was not something that we had all been brought up understanding to believe had a certain look about it, then we wouldn't care. But to me, I think the reason DNA has been given, has been pushed, this image has been pushed. No one has gone out of their way to disprove it. You can argue it's because they don't have the equipment to disprove it. But nobody, now that the equipment exists, has disproved it. And is that because when you want something to be absorbed by the community or by the public, you have to have a very strong image attached to it. And DNA, we all know what we've been told DNA looks like. So can we capture images better than that? Well, apparently we can. So in 2017, I believe, they have now got the most powerful electron microscope. It can make images to the resolution of half the width of a hydrogen atom. Okay, so just to get this in your head. So a nanometer is 10 times smaller than the width of your DNA, okay? So DNA is 10 times bigger than a nanometer. But a nanometer is 10 times bigger than the size of an atom. So DNA in comparison to an atom is, I think it works out 100 times bigger, which would make sense, because obviously DNA is made up of proteins, and proteins are made up of atoms, so atoms in themselves are going to be smaller than the structure of DNA. So this powerful microscope can make images to the resolution of half the width of a hydrogen atom. So why can it not take a picture of DNA, or why is it not being used for DNA? And it hasn't. They're taking images of atoms, that's for sure, because one of the arguments was that DNA was too fragile to be used under an electron microscope of any great power. But if you can photograph, apparently, or take an image of an atom, which I should imagine is pretty fragile, you can take an image of DNA, and they haven't taken an image. There's nothing recent regarding DNA imagery. These apparently are images of real atoms. And then also what I found quite interesting is, so we don't have a true image of DNA. We have a structure that was assembled 60 odd years ago by two guys who stole other people's data, and was drawn up by their artistic wife. They come from Cambridge, and I'm hoping to make a video on that as a topic. I have been to Cambridge, if you've seen some of my other videos, but I actually have some research that I want to produce into a video at some point about different scientists that have come from Cambridge. And so I'm questioning whether even if that structure is true. So then I found this. Now this was 2011, so this was before the first supposed pictures of DNA were taken with an electron microscope. And they're talking about how DNA can actually form different structures than double helixes. It says it's a rarity. How they would know that unless they can actually see DNA is bizarre. But it says that we show that the simple DNA double helix exists in an alternative form. Well, okay, so I can't disprove that. If you can't prove, at this point in 2011, there was no image of real DNA, yet they seem to be able to, through computer generated pictures, because that's obviously what that is, show you that actually DNA can be formed in other ways. So now we can see DNA, or can we not see DNA? Are they doing it through the principles of how these different proteins work? And what I also quite enjoy is how all down the side here, I mean, this is astrobiology, exploring the solar system and beyond. So we have a nice little hint of evolution here, which leads me on to my next subject in this video, is how DNA has been a beautiful avenue to go down to help prove evolution. And I think that's part of the process. I think when evolution come along, it was absorbed by the science community and embraced. And it would do, it would be, because evolution kind of disproved, in theory, in people's minds, or gave them a gateway out of religion, and it was embraced. But up until the 1950s, or around about the time that they were trying to discover DNA, they had nothing to kind of back it up, nothing to prove it. So DNA came about, and like I said, I do believe that there is something within us that you and I would probably call DNA. But they had to have something that would give it a visualization for, Joe Bloggs on the street, something that we would all recognize, that can be pushed in our faces. You don't even have to understand what DNA is, you just see the image of it. This is why the structure of DNA was so important, and something had to be produced that we could all relate to. And it was latched onto evolution, always has been since. So I just want to show you some, just how DNA in this modern world is pushed on to us through and connected to evolution. So have a look at this video.
If Darwin came back today, what would he be most excited by in modern science? I think it would be the whole world of genetics. That's the answer to all the big questions he had. How does variation emerge, and how could that be transmitted?
Let's return to our brown bears stranded in the Arctic to consider the impact of genetics on our understanding of evolution. Each bear is made up of cells, and if we take a brown bear cell and tunnel into its nucleus, we find DNA, the molecule with the genetic instructions for building, in this case, a brown bear, written in a 4-letter code. Now, the thing about DNA, it's not perfect. When it's copied, mistakes get made. Mutations, in other words, that sometimes affect an organism's traits and that sometimes can be passed from parent to offspring. So the variation at the heart of evolution, it's genetic variation. Slight differences in DNA that, for example, could make some bears a bit lighter in color, a bit more insulated against the cold, and a bit more capable of digesting fattier foods like seals.
Evolution is essentially any change in the genetic composition of a population.
Mutations are random, so they're not always helpful, but the bears with mutations that gave them some advantage for Arctic living survived and reproduced more often than bears without them. They passed the genes responsible for those adaptations onto their cubs. Over generations, more bears inherited and elaborated on these and other changes in the DNA. The eventual result? A polar bear. And when we tunnel into its cells, we find polar bear DNA. Think of DNA as the raw material that, across billions of years, evolution has molded and built into countless forms of life. We are all related, tied to one another by the most spectacular of double helical threads.
So yeah, as you can see, it's very interesting how they jump from things like adaptation to using the word evolution when it's not really the true definition of the word. And I do also know that many people that study science that come across evolution very confused about what the actual meaning of it is. Unless you study it in depth, it's taken for granted that it's just adaptation, but it's not. That's not what evolution is. That's not what they're selling you. So anyway, moving on. Just to add a little bit more information for you, just to add kind of something more current. We're inundated today about DNA's websites, track your ancestry, take DNA and see where you come from, and there's actually quite some interesting stories about how people have sent off their DNA and had several different results from different DNA ancestry tests. Because believe it or not, normal DNA testing is really quite flexible and it's not always 100%. So all these years later, I really still do not believe that they understand what it is, and that when we're told that we have the sequencing of DNA and all this kind of thing, I'm skeptical. Even in this modern world, whether these are a scam and they're just, trying to make money out of you or not, or whether really literally DNA is not that reliable in its basic form when you're testing it. You need huge amounts of DNA to test so that you are absolutely sure that somebody left that DNA there. It's not cut and dry. It really isn't when you look into it. I could have gone into a lot more detail, but I think it's one of those subjects that you just really can't prove either way. But it's important, I think, that when you are coming face to face with scientists, and if you haven't already come across holes in theories that scientists throw out there at you, and I'm assuming that probably many of you have, if you haven't come across them, it's important that you understand that just because it's written and some guy on TV tells you it's true and the majority of people believe it is, it doesn't make it true. And if you have in your heart this ability to believe men that have no proof to give you, it is a set of beliefs. It is a form of faith. You put your faith in science. You put your faith in someone who you think knows more than you do, because maybe it doesn't matter to you that much. But this idea of faith and putting it into something, I think it's something that we all have intrinsically inside of us. And so I just ask, if you are willing to rest your understanding towards men who really have only ever proven, if you look back in history and many of the theories that are going around today, have only ever proven how unreliable and deceptive they can be. But how much different is it then to turn and possibly look at the Bible and understand that it's a series of stories that have happened through the history of the world that is there to teach you something. And you can buy into the myth that the Bible is about a vengeful, hateful God, and it really, really isn't. So I just ask that you put your faith in maybe something else. I used to be an atheist. I used to look at science and I used to rest all my trust in it. I used to love astronomy. I used to believe we went to the moon. I believed in all of those things. I loved biology. I trusted it all. And slowly, when you etch away at the things that you're told, scraping away the surface, realizing that actually there's no basis in it. There's no actual real foundation in it. Realize that maybe you could be wrong about other things too. Maybe you can be wrong about the judgment you passed on people with faith, on Christians. Maybe you were too quick and too harsh and too hasty to turn the Bible away. I found that was true with me. Finding faith in God and Jesus Christ has been the best thing that's ever happened to me. Anyway, thank you for watching.